Hello, this is Vic Hermanson of the Trailer Trash Terrors podcast. Come with me for a few minutes
to July 4th, 1942.
Last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare amongst the stinging air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the
This podcast is being compiled on July 4th, 2022. I'm celebrating the birth of our nation, the only nation in the history of mankind that was founded on a cohesive, fundamental, and noble set of moral principles, and not just the desire to consolidate power or to enslave the populace. Happy 4th of July. Happy Independence Day.
Greetings, temporal humans. This is Boudreaux, the patriotic, God-fearing, ever-evolving cybernetic ghost from the future. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 3, of the Trailer Trash Terrors podcast. This week, Vic Hermanson has 3 distinct terrors to discuss, from 3 different listeners. Therefore, this episode is titled Triple Delight Plus a Fortune Cookie. We invite you to terror trip along with us. It's the best entertainment deal going, I guarantee.
Trailer Trash
In my mind, this episode represents a real hallmark for Trailer Trash Terrors, a real turning point. The reason is that I have 3 stories provided tonight by listeners, people who heard the show and took the time to send in their own thoughts, their own stories. So, we have 3 different terrors. And the first terror is the terror that any human being may face at any time during their life. And that is the terror of self-loathing. It's the terror of believing that one's innate self has no value and no meaning. There is no greater terror. Give me a Bigfoot. Give me a Megalodon. Give me a vampire. Give me any of those things, as long as I have a belief in myself. I can handle them. But keep that terror away from me if you can.
Listener supply terror number 1, the thing in my brain that hates me. Provided by Robert N. from Salinas, California.
The thing in my brain that hates me. I am 10 or 11 years old. We live in a small rented house in Louisville, Kentucky. I am helping my mother move an old wood or metal couch. Neither of us are strong enough to move it by ourselves, nor will it easily fit through the door. I have a strong desire, born of hope, to help my mother get our house the way she wants it. Maybe then, I thought, she'll be happy, she'll smile, she'll laugh with me. I slowly rotate the couch, such that it is standing on its end, and once I get it vertical, I lose control of it. It starts to fall toward my mother, and hits the wall above her head with a loud, resounding crash, and I can't see her behind the couch. I cry out, frightened, "Mom, did that hit you?" She answers, her voice saturated with pain, but not physical pain. "No, but I wish it had, and I wish it had killed me." I sense the tremendous desperation in what she has said. I run to her and say, imploringly, "Mom, I love you." She looks me square in the face and says with genuine venom, "I don't want your kind of love." I have no idea what to say, and I spend the rest of the day trying to be invisible. There are many days that I tried to be invisible. Now, many years later, I realize how deeply depressed she must have been, how desperate she must have felt, and how helpless she must have perceived herself to be in possibly changing the situation. Shortly after this event, she disappeared for several months. She went away to become an inpatient in what was then called Our Lady of Peace Psychiatric Hospital. Throughout my childhood, she disappeared into various psychiatric hospitals multiple times. Occasionally, I would get to visit her, but not often. When I did, she was nervous and uncertain, and would usually show me a belt or a small clay figure she had made. I remember hoping that the time she spent making these things would help her. I was a child, and I had no idea what these hospital admissions really entailed. Over her various psychiatric admissions, my mother received more than 150 shock treatments, or electroconvulsive therapy treatments. They may have helped her, but I really don't know. I do know that, because of these treatments, huge sections of her memory of our lives together, of our family, our home, and her children simply disappeared. As an adult, I realize how hard she worked to love me and my siblings the best she could in spite of her illness. I think often of the tremendous honor that exists in that effort, the internal pain she carried, that she sometimes expressed in anger and condemnation, was not something that she was ever able to completely remove from her soul. As a child, I felt it was my absolute duty to help her heal, to help her escape from that relentless pain in her mind and in her very being. Of course, in pursuing that quest, I was doomed to failure. But children don't know this, and I suppose there was at least some honor in the trying. There are hundreds of stories that are similar to this one, but the stories themselves are just moments in time. Thousands of people have stories like these, and far, far worse. They are part of the tapestry we weave in our minds to remember our lives, but they are far less important than learning why her mind was so full of pain and despair. In trying to learn as much as I can about the factors that brought about my mother's illness, I have studied the family history through whatever means are possible. I have read their old letters, I have found forgotten diaries in attics, and I've spent hours examining their faces and body language in old crumbling photos. As I have come to know them more as people and not just distant names, not even memories, I have concluded that many of them were severely depressed and lived their lives self-medicating, usually through alcohol, and doing all they could to face a life that might never be free of pain, sadness, and anxiety. Who I am is at least partially due to the genetic legacy they left me. I have received their curly hair, their short stature, perhaps their intelligence, but I have also, unfortunately, inherited their tendency to experience clinical depression. If you're fighting this fight, this war against depression, and understand it is a war, it is very important to realize that there is much more to the disease than just sadness. Sadness is at least a normal emotion, and often it makes perfect sense. It can help a healthy mind heal, and as it fades, it can help us better appreciate our lives, those we love, and the genuine wonder that does exist in the world. There is something far more damaging than the sadness, at least with me. There is a personal, agency-driven, internally interactive aspect of it. And that aspect of the disease can be a genuine nightmare. I don't want to sound too dramatic, but in plain, simple words, there is a thing in my brain that hates me. It hates me as much as anything can be hated. Its hatred is not rational, and it cannot be bargained with. I can only assume that the goal of the thing that hates me is my ultimate destruction, my ceasing to be. It has become blindingly clear to me that if I want to live a life with any kind of quality, that I will, for as long as I live, be engaged in daily battle with this thing in my brain. To not fight, literally, is to die, is to cease to be. I have read that in many ancient societies, there has been a need to name the enemy in order to gain some degree of control over it. I don't want to name this thing. I don't want to give it that degree of respect. I want eventually to kill it. I need that goal. One of the most horrible things about depression is that it can take away your will to fight. It can take away your will to even exist. Hanging on to the goal of killing the thing in my brain is one way of screaming to the universe that I have a right to be, a right to a life, and all that that involves. I don't want peace with it. I don't want coexistence with it. I don't want an understanding. I want it dead. I can't remember the exact age when I first heard its voice. I can't remember exactly when I first felt the coldness and emptiness that it clearly wishes me to feel. I think it probably whispered to me by the time I was 9. I think it spoke with a bit more volume and clarity by the time I was 15. But by the time I was 30, it was a constant cacophony in my mind. It would say, "You are nothing. You have no value. There is nothing good about you. It would be better if you were dead. They can't love you. No one can love you. No matter how hard you try, you will fail." It would go on and on. The thing's vocabulary is pretty small and not very sophisticated. It is a cudgel, not an elegantly designed weapon. But if a cudgel is used to beat your mind, your concept of yourself, your belief in your place in the goodness of creation, it takes a toll. It takes a major toll. When there are multiple, painful, stressful, and negative events, the thing in my brain that hates me becomes much stronger. I believe it is likely that the thing will always be a part of me, part of my psyche, part of my soul, if you will. 5 or 6 times in my life it has become strong and pervasive and terrible. Each time it arises, it seems to be stronger than the last time it made itself known, the last time it attacked. I have found a medication that over time takes away some of its power, but I've never found a medication that eliminates it. Therapy has helped a few times, but personally, I have found it to be very formulaic and very repetitive. There may be additional things for me to learn from it, but if one wishes to win a war, one does not discard any potentially useful weapon. But the bottom line comes down to fighting the thing in my brain with every bit of my soul, every bit of my strength, and every bit of my being. There is an inescapable aloneness to depression. No one else can hear the thing in my brain that hates me. No one else can experience the undeserved power that it can have. It's my personal ancient enemy. It's the hyena stalking the lion in the shrouded darkness. But the goal of silencing it, of killing it, even damaging it, of just having a dozen days in a row when there is no merciless attack in my mind, no words of hatred towards me, must be, at this point in my life, the overarching goal of my existence. The thing in my brain that hates me wants me to believe that every person I have ever cared about hates me also. Or perhaps, even worse than hatred, it wants me to believe that they are simply indifferent to me, that their lives would be unaffected, unchanged, if I ceased to exist. I am Catholic. I believe in a loving God. I also believe in the primacy of physical causality. I believe that my prayers are heard and that God loves the soul, that is me. I also believe that in the end, I have the ultimate responsibility of controlling and strengthening my mind. I have always found the Bible to be a part of that effort, and there is a verse that I memorized long ago from the book of John, chapter 8, verse 44. You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. I am certain that many people reading or listening to this have their own things in their brains that hate them. I have to remind myself every day that the thing is a liar. The thing is nothing but a liar. If it ever touches the truth, it is only for the purpose of making a malicious lie more powerful. Fight it. If it won't be silent, understand that it lies and does nothing but lie. I don't know why it's there, but I believe that there is at least some power in acknowledging that it is, and in telling anyone who will listen that I will not give it free rein. I do matter. I do have value. I am worthy of being loved and loving. So I will fight this damn thing until there is no life left in me, or until it is dead. There is simply no other rational or honorable choice.
Listener supplied terror number 2, The Glimmering, Camouflaged Forest Giant. Provided by Paul Craig W., from Danville, Kentucky.
So, I have a couple of stories, one of which is pretty mundane, but one of which is clearly not. And these are stories that you just can't tell people. They happen to me. They are real events. But when you try to talk to people about them, either they just ignore you and kind of zone out, or they ridicule you. Very, very seldom can you find anyone who'll just listen and try to take what you say into account and take your personality into account. So anyway, about 15 years ago, I was going through a period of time where my marriage was kind of falling apart. And at that time, I got a job, a consulting job, to go down to Australia and to work with the Aboriginal Health Service down there. So for about 2.5 weeks, I was pretty much out in the Australian desert, which is hot. And I had some vacation, so I decided to stay there in Australia for 3 more weeks, because that's what I had. And I had had my fill of the desert. So I flew down from Alice Springs down to Melbourne, rented a Mitsubishi Pajero, and started taking myself across the various national parks and mountains and all the things that you can go to along the Great Ocean Road. Went to the Grampians. I was over somewhere in the Yarra Ranges, and I'm a hiker, I'm a camper, I'm someone who's spent years in the woods, and feel very, very comfortable. The difference there is you really have to watch for snakes, especially if you get away from civilization. So I found myself going to, say, the Yarra Ranges, finding a trailhead, and getting the maps they had, and just taking myself back as far back in those forests, as far back in those ranges as I could get. And sometimes I could get, at least, I wouldn't go more than 2 days away. That just seemed prudent. There was water. I had my filters. I could be comfortable out there in those woods for 2-3 days. Well, one hike, I was a day and a half out or so, and at that point the trails start to become kind of conceptual trails. Nobody's been on them for a long time, and they kind of grow over. But I was coming around this bend in this one trail, and stepped up from these rocks, and it was sweeping around to the right where you couldn't see what was on the other side. But as I came around that bend, there was an animal there. And I swear it was a thylacine. The thing was as big as a large, skinny dog. Had this tremendously long tail, had the stripes, really, really stood up on its toes, had these black eyes. But the thing that made it very clear to me what it was just how huge this thing's head was and how huge his mouth was. All through Australia, I had my camera out. It had been sprinkling a little bit earlier in the day, and I had put it in this waterproof pouch I had. And the thylacine and I just stood there and stared at each other for about 2-3 seconds. It just turned to the left, and in 2 or 3 bounds, it was gone. There was no way I was ever going to see that thing. And you just cannot go into the Australian raw bush and expect to not have something bad happen to you. With snakes and spiders and that sort of thing. But if anybody tells me that the thylacine is extinct, I'm going to tell them no, it's not. And the reason I know it's not extinct is because I stood 15 feet away from one and stared in its eyes. I knew it wasn't a brindle dingo. I've seen those. There's just no other animal it could have been. Some people have told me it was a numbat, but a numbat's about the size of a house cat. This thing was the size of a Doberman Pinscher or something like that. It was a big animal. So I think that's just a story of, being lucky enough to see an animal that most of the world thinks is extinct. But the next event that I had to do with running into what I perceived to be a yowie. And it was on the same trail. I had seen the thylacine and decided just to keep hiking until that evening when I could find some place where I could, set up my hammock or set up find some place to sleep. They didn't want you starting fires back there, so everything I had was dry, cold food. So I didn't have that to look forward to. But anyway, as you get toward the eastern side of the Yarra Ranges, it starts to become more mountainous, and the trees thin out a little bit. I became aware of some sound off to the side of something that seemed to be pacing me, staying right where I was. I also became aware of a very, very serious smell, and I also became aware of the fact that none of the other animals, all the sounds of the forest, were gone. And so I was aware that, okay, something's out here. I don't have a weapon. There's no reason for me to run because I'm a day and a half away from civilization. And I just stopped and went and, sat on some rocks that were there. Just started looking around. Now, here's the thing. I started seeing trees sway. I started seeing things move off in the distance. And I swear I was looking directly at this thing. And it was like its fur, its hair was like a metamaterial. It's like the fur itself bent the light around the creature. So you ended up mostly seeing the leaves and the trees that were behind it. If it moved in certain ways, where the sun angle changed, you started to see it. Okay, so here's the description. Not a standard Bigfoot like you would have in California or Oregon or Washington. Not a patty. This had a snout and was insanely muscular. Probably 9 feet tall. I wanted there to be footprints, but I mean, you really don't understand the feeling of, okay, I'm looking across the road. There's a 9-foot tall creature that I can only see part of the time. It's looking at me. I can smell it. I can hear it. I can hear its breathing. And if it decides it wants to kill me, if it decides it wants to hurt me, if it decides it wants to abduct me, there's not a dang thing I can do about it. I mean, I'm, 5'7", probably then I weighed 150 pounds, and was, I was athletic and I was good at hiking, but I surely wasn't going to fight off a 9-foot, 600-pound creature. There were, one of the things that you could see that did not seem to be subject to the optical illusion of the fur or the hair was its eyes. And they were astoundingly intelligent and aware. And they were sort of pissed. They were, it was very clear it wasn't happy that I was back there. So for a good 2-3 minutes, I just sat there on those rocks. He wasn't going anywhere. I finally decided that this was his way of telling me, you need to get the hell out of here. So I, my heart beating like crazy, I'm sweating, I'm kind of trying not to make my pants a mess, everything I can do to try to keep myself together. And so finally I stand up and just start backing up. And once again, as I would back up, I would see this shimmering, this metamaterial kind of effect where it was just almost impossible to see. If you weren't looking, and if it didn't have a smell, you wouldn't be aware of anything. But occasionally, like I say, I would get at an angle where I could see this thing better. So, 9-foot creature, 600 pounds, perhaps, incredibly muscular, very, very intelligent, piercing eyes, and a snout. I mean, that's all I can tell you. It was a head. It was a snout. It wasn't like an ape face. It was like a dog face, but not quite that long. Huge, huge hands. Anyway, once I got back around, or back onto that trail, and got far enough away where it didn't seem to be there, it didn't follow me, I decided that, okay, I hope that I have enough battery in my flashlight just to hike all the way back to my Pajero, which back then, if you remember, I mean, there weren't, it wasn't LEDs, it was an incandescent flashlight. But finally, I was not comfortable. I was scared. There was no possible way that I could run that far. I was worried that I couldn't even hike that far. But I just hiked straight through. It was mid-afternoon when I saw this animal, and I hiked till 2-3 in the morning, back to the Pajero. It was there. I hadn't lost my keys. And I looked for a ranger to talk about this. And as soon as I started talking about either creature, the thylacine or the yowie, whatever it was, he became really quite hostile. Said something like, you stupid Americans think you can, come here and tell some bullshit stories. Anyway, so those are my stories. I don't tell them to very many people. I try most of the time to just be quiet. It hasn't changed my view of the woods. I still love going out in the woods. There was no bluff charge. There was no attack. There was no anything other than just those piercing eyes and that smell telling me to, as far as I could tell, get the hell out of those woods. Anyway, thanks for your time. Bye-bye.
Listener supply terror number 3, this one is titled, A Foolish Boy and the Ghostly Guardian Hand. Provided by Ray J. Whitehead, from Pascagoula, Mississippi.
I'm a southern boy. I come from Louisiana. I know I don't really sound like it anymore, but I am. I lived in a little tiny town called Converse, Louisiana, and was there when John Kennedy was assassinated. I was a little boy. I've had some time on my hands lately and started thinking about some kind of remarkable things that happened to me then. So I took some time and just recorded one of the stories. So I thought I would send it to you, thinking you might find it useful for your show. If so, feel free to use it. You can contact me through my email. Here's the story. Thanks. Really enjoy your show. Most of my life has been mundane, somewhat boring, and 100% devoid of anything paranormal or supernatural. I'm an amateur astronomer and have spent hundreds of hours looking at the night sky. I've seen several things that I cannot explain. To me, they are just additional pieces of wonder in the creation of God, so I don't worry about them. I've spent years in the deep woods alone, and with my sons, and I've never seen a Bigfoot or anything that was not easily explained. But when I was a child in the deep, rural wasteland of Louisiana, I did have an experience over several months with something that I cannot explain through the normal rules of physical causality. I don't know if I experienced a ghost, some rift in reality, or just a memory that was attached to a place. But whatever it was, it probably saved my life, and it left a mark on me that is still warm, wondrous, and very pure. The town was Converse, Louisiana. The year was 1964. And I can remember the time this experience started, because it was just a few months after President Kennedy had been assassinated. We moved away from that town several months later, and I left behind what was perhaps the purest friend I have ever had or ever will have. My family lived in a trailer just east of what is now called Evans Loop. Almost everything that was there is now gone, but in 1964, there was an abandoned oil derrick and toxic waste dump just behind the trailer, a huge deep pine forest, and most importantly, an abandoned ice production facility, or as we called it, the ice house. It was a masonry building, perhaps 75 years old, the size of a gymnasium, with basements that extended far underground. It was filled with abandoned machinery that in the past had used ammonia to make huge blocks of ice that would be delivered throughout that part of Louisiana with trucks and probably horse-drawn wagons. There were metal vats within it the size of cars, and these were filled with years of stagnant and green water, snakes, insects, and even nutria, which I thought of as rats as large as medium-sized dogs. Somehow, there was still electricity in the building. It had high glass windows, most of which had been broken, chains hanging from overhead gantries, and massive holes had developed in the slowly deteriorating concrete floor. Vagrants would sometimes sleep there. Teenage boys would go there to smoke and tell stories of their bravery, and occasionally, but very occasionally, the local sheriff would drop by to make sure nobody had taken up residence there. It was an absolute death trap for a young boy, and I was forbidden to go there. That meant, of course, that I went there as often as I could. I can still see the streaks of sunlight that filtered through the moist, dusty, stinking air of that old ice house, making the deep shadows within even more ominous. If a boy wandered deep enough into the pine woods behind the ice house, he would find a family living back there in an ancient compound of log cabins. They had no electricity or running water, and being curious, I would hide in the trees and watch the family, hoping to play with some of the many children. Eventually, they noticed me, and a kindly, tiny, gray-haired and toothless woman told me I was welcome to play as long as I didn't bring no trouble or haints. Those were her words, and I had no idea what a haint might be. I know this family's name, but I will not say it here as they deserve their privacy. The family was multiple generations and generally unremarkable except for one thing. About half of them had 6 fingers on each hand. These weren't loosely attached digits hanging from the side of a normal finger, as you sometimes see, but true 6-fingered hands that were strong and supple. As the kids were often barefoot, I could see that some of them had 6 toes on each foot, though not as many. These too were fully functional toes, just attached to a very wide foot. I asked the kindly old lady why the family's hands and feet were the way they were, and she said, "God made us this way, child. It means we're guardians. That's the guardian hand. Haints see that strong hand with the extra finger, and they will not come out of the shadows. It's a gift from God. It's a gift from the Lord, and our family is blessed. Now you go play." So I did, and soon it was just a normal part of that family. Their house was too far away for me to hear my mother calling me, but one of the young girls with 6 fingers knew exactly when my mom wanted me to come home. She was always right. My father told me to not go around those trashy, crazy people, but he was rarely there, and the children were my friends. Over time, the old lady asked me to call her Grandma Sally. She wore an apron with a huge pocket, and that pocket always held a tattered black Bible. She would look at me and say, "You get your letters, child, then you can read the word of the Lord." And she would pat the Bible and beam. I never told her that I could already read. My father was a man who learned to be a good man later in his life, but when I was a child, he had not yet completed that lesson. He was absolutely jubilant about the death of John Kennedy. LBJ asked the nation to leave their porch lights burning as a tribute to the fallen president, and my dad shot out our porch light with an old pistol that he kept in his truck. Soon, he and my mother were screaming at each other any time he was home, so I retreated to the guardians in the woods and the terrifying and deeply inviting ice house where I was forbidden to go. One hot spring morning, well, it's never really cold in that part of Louisiana for long, I escaped the turmoil in my home and went seeking adventure in the ice house. I snuck in through a broken delivery door and started to explore, walking between the vats, poking at the occasional snake with a stick, trying to figure out the functions of the rusted machinery, wondering why there was so much salt on the floor. Yes, I tasted it, and simply reveling in the freedom, quiet, and the palpable fear that remained in that place. I'm not a sensitive or an empath, but this crumbling building had seen so much pain, so much tragedy, so much betrayal, that its walls, the vats of water, the crumbling floors, and the hanging chains were all saturated with human suffering, desperate to be heard, and screaming to be comforted. That's when I saw 2 things that are critical parts of this story. First, there was a place in one of the back corners of the ice house that seemed to absorb all light that found its way there. It wasn't just darkness, so much as it was a malignant, insect-like nothingness. It pulsed, and if it loved anything at all, it was only meaningless, anger-driven death. That malignant nothingness called to me. I heard it, and I knew that I could resist that call for only a short time. It called, "Victor, come here. This is what you want to find." At the same time, I saw a wooden plank that extended across one of the vats. The idea might have come from within my mind, but I'm not at all sure of that. I saw myself as a circus tightrope walker, tall and muscular and smiling, traversing that plank with limitless skill and bravery instead of the dirty, sweaty, barefoot 6-year-old boy I really was. I headed toward that plank, determined to walk across it. I could see that it was old and gray, and that it was already full of cracks and places where the wood had chipped away, but I headed toward it anyway. As my right foot was about to step on the board, the very air, it seemed, spoke to me. The words were in my head, and they were pressure against my skin, and my ears reverberated with a sound
I could not locate in 3 dimensions. It was a voice that had not spoken in a very long time. It was a voice full of dust and cobwebs and creaky hinges. One could hear the memory of long-ago regrets and faded triumphs in that voice. Of course, as a 6-year-old child, I just heard a voice that I knew should be listened to. It said, "You commence across that board, and your mama ain't never gonna find you." I froze in place, and I stared into the water. I looked at the broken delivery door and at the beams of light streaming from the ceiling, looking for the source of that sound. I felt something, some energy in that great, wet room, but I saw nothing. I backed away from the vat. Again, I heard the voice from the air and in my head. It was firm, but not unkind. "Now you get out of here. Maybe you come back directly, and maybe, just maybe, I'll be able to mugrify. It feels like a damn long time." That was the word I heard. Mugrify. I had no idea what it meant, but I knew that it mattered. The word damn shocked me a little bit, but soon such words just felt like a natural part of him. Yes, he had a name, but the story of how I learned that name matters a great deal and deserves its own telling. As I made my way to the broken door, I did see a shimmering like an old photograph that didn't develop correctly. He was thin and tall. I could see through him, but I knew he had farmer's skin and old, heavy boots. He had the kind of hair that always does just what it wants, whether it's working in the field or trying to look civilized in church. His left arm pointed toward the door, and his right arm was held out to his side, as if he were holding something back. He had sinew and corded muscles, and the arms held the shadow of what had once been tremendous strength. I met his eyes, or at least it felt like I met his eyes. He glanced toward the door, and I followed his gaze down toward his hand, which was strong and wide and endowed with 6 functional fingers. Yes, I did go back. I felt I was probably safe there. No, I've never told this story to anyone, not even my mother, though I think she knew some of it. It was a few months of safety in a very dysfunctional family. Yes, this story is real. Yes, I've taken the time to write it in a way that conveys my memories and emotions and to record it the best I can. And yes, other parts of the story will be told as time goes by. And yes, I realize that many people will perceive me to be either a fantasist or a liar. I am comfortable that I am neither. These experiences are part of a gift that God granted me, and the memory of the guardian hand still brings me comfort and makes me think of Grandma Sally and her ancient Bible.
Boy, you know, above almost all things in the world, I love stories. One of my favorite TV shows is Supernatural, you know, with Sam and Dean and Castiel and a cast of thousands of monsters and vampires and angels and demons and Crowley. Well, one of the characters in that show, one of the least likable characters, was Metatron. I always thought that was an interesting name, Metatron. It's like a Transformer name. In the series, he's the scribe of God. And as he's living with humans, he loves nothing more than stories. He just wants to hear as many stories as he can possibly hear. I'm kind of the same way. The first respondent tonight, you know, our first story from Robert was extremely brave. It takes courage to talk about the fact that the events of life, the chemistry of your brain, the way that you are is not always fantastic. He's talking about the thing in his brain that hates him, almost as if it's a living entity. I think it is a living entity. Anyway, that's a hell of a frightening story, and I want to thank Robert for having the courage to send it in. I hope I did it justice. One thing I can promise you is that on Trailer Trash Terrors, your stories will always be treated respectfully. I simply assume that the people who take the time to write to me, to tell me those things that are in their hearts, they're telling me the truth. Why would they do otherwise? We all have terrors, regrets, fears, experiences, things that we either wish had never happened or things that we've learned from. Let's move on to Paul, our second story. There's a photograph that is hard to find, and when this podcast gets a webpage, I'll make sure it gets up there. But it's a photograph of a thing sitting under a tree next to several young men who are working as what I believe was part of the Australian Works Progress Administration program. Young men who were given jobs up in the Blue Mountains doing logging, clearing trees, this kind of thing. Well, one day they had a day off, and one of them had a brownie camera. So they took a picture of this young man sitting on a log. Well, behind him is a creature about 9, 10, maybe 12 feet tall. Looks like the classic depiction of a dog man, sort of. But what he's doing is he's sitting with his head looking straight down. And they had no idea that it was there when they took the picture. I think the picture's genuine. I look at it, and I've looked at it for hours and hours. And to me, there was a creature sitting there that had the ability to cloak itself, at least partially, from the rest of the world. And if you've spent much time out in the woods, you just think about a deer. How often have you stood next to a deer 10, 12 feet, just staring directly at the deer, just in any regular forest? It's just about invisible. There's nothing metamaterial, there's nothing paranormal about that deer at all. It's just that your brain doesn't really see that color when you're in the forest. I have no question at all that what Paul is talking about is a genuine part of nature, a genuine part of reality. I would so deeply love to see a creature like that. According to Paul, had this creature wished to kill him, there wouldn't have been anything he could do. I don't want to be killed, but I sure would like to have the experience. Ray J talks about ghosts, something that I have a real problem with. I want to do a future episode concerning ghost photos because I think they have certain commonalities. I think there's some things we can learn from them. But I have a real problem thinking that humans, if we have an afterlife, that we spend our time here on Earth opening cabinets, closing doors, showing up at the end of a dark hallway just when people happen to be walking by. Why would we be doing these ridiculous things? Why would we want such a banal existence after our life? But here he's talking about a protective ghost, a ghost that actually, according to him, saved his life. Well, that's the kind of ghost to have around. I personally believe that most of what people think of as ghosts are some other entity, something that is very, very lonesome, very lonely, and wants nothing more than the warmth and the connectedness of being human. But please write to me and tell me why I'm wrong about that, or tell me your ghost stories. We'll talk about them. Right now in my life, I'm just not at all sure that ghosts are really part of the actual world, even the actual paranormal world. I guess I need to apologize about the inconsistency in the recording quality between these stories. Because of travel and other issues, I ended up using 3 different recording techniques or microphones to get this information down. I'm an absolute perfectionist, but I don't know how much it really matters. If I make sure that every recorded clip is just perfect and sounds exactly like all others, I don't know. Let me know what you think. Should I have re-recorded those things that were on different microphones or recording platforms? Or does it just not matter that much? I don't know. Well, you've had your triple delight. And I promised you a fortune cookie. And so here it comes. When was the last time you actually read the Declaration of Independence? You know, the Declaration. It'll be July 5th by the time this show gets published, but that's close enough. The Declaration is really a pretty interesting little document. It's as important as the Constitution, and it takes about 10 minutes to read. The Constitution maybe takes half an hour to really read well. So, even though it's not a terror, even though I consider it a treasure, a wonder, an incredible triumph of the human mind and the human spirit, I'm going to read you the Declaration of Independence tonight. Please stick around. Just listen to it. Even though I don't read it terribly well, the people who wrote it, man, those were some minds. Those were some hearts. Those were some incredibly brave and powerful souls. So I'm going to read it to you. I think I'll turn the swamp sounds off for the time I'm reading that, because it deserves something far more honorable, even though there's nothing terribly dishonorable about swamp sounds. Okay, here's the fortune cookie, the Declaration of Independence. In Congress, July 4th, 1776. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the law of nature and nature's God entitles them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shewn that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world, to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right to representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual and uncomfortable and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the right of the people. He has refused for a long time, after such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payments of their salaries. He has elected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us, in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, by cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, by transporting us beyond the seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and in enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coast, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, dissolution, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens, taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We've reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They, too, have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from the allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all the other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. You know, there's not a great deal one can say after that. That's what my country is about. If you are listening from some other country, listen to that. If you are happy with the level of freedom that your country offers, I'm happy for you. If you're not, that's the way people go about gaining that freedom. Documents like that. Okay, let's call it to a close. My name is Vic Hermanson. Trailer Trash Terrors is produced and written by me, Vic Hermanson. The music you heard was provided by Loco Lobo and Smart Sound. Also tonight, you heard a 1910 wax cylinder recording from the Edison Corporation. I would say it's probably out of copyright. Please contact me concerning anything about the show, your stories, your thoughts, things you'd like the world to know. Let us know your terrors. Contact me at trailertrashterrors@gmail.com. Until next week, this has been Vic Hermanson, and thank you so very much for listening to
Trailer